What if I told you that the fate of kingdoms depended less on knights and more on kitchen maids armed with poison and sneaky merchants? Most medieval wars were won by shadows, not shining armor. Today we're pulling back the curtain on the real special forces of the Middle Ages, spies, assassins, and saboteurs who made sure chivalry never stood a chance. Stay with me, because those Hollywood charges, they're just the cleanup crew after the dirty work is done. Ever notice how every medieval movie makes a huge deal out of knights in shiny armor, banners waving, and the big slow-motion charge across muddy fields? Swords flash, horses rear up, and it looks like everyone's living their best life in a history textbook. But here's a weird thought. When was the last time you saw anyone slip a pinch of powder into the king's wine, or quietly pass a dodgy loaf of bread to a rival lord? Hollywood has us convinced that the Middle Ages ran on honor and clashing steel, but the real story is nowhere near that tidy. If you walked across a battlefield in, say, the year 1300, you'd have to look hard to find those polished swords. Most of the people fighting wouldn't even have them. Swords, back then, were the medieval version of luxury goods. Think iPhones, but even harder to come by. Let's talk about the economics for a second. Owning a sword wasn't just about knowing how to use one. It was a statement, a family achievement, even a passport into the club of people who mattered. A good sword could cost months, or even years of wages, for a regular laborer. If your family farmed a few strips of land or ran a tiny shop, buying a sword made as much sense as buying a racing horse today. Not likely, unless you had gold stashed under your mattress. For most people, the weapon of choice was whatever you found lying around, a hayfork, a heavy stick, or maybe, if you were lucky, a rusty kitchen knife. Suits of armor? They might as well have been made out of gold. Only the highest-ranking warriors had a chance at wearing anything more protective than thick wool and maybe, if they were really splurging, some leather. Now add recent studies to the mix, because historians love crunching the numbers on this stuff. The average medieval soldier did not march into battle wrapped in shining steel. Most had to make do with padded cloth or piecemeal odds and ends, maybe a scavenged helmet, or if Uncle Bob got unlucky, his old shield with a dent or two. If someone actually owned a matching set of armor, they'd guard it with their life. Outside of film sets, most armies looked less like Knights of the Round Table and more like angry crowds at a county fair where everyone forgot to dress up. And about those famous sweeping battles, turns out, a lot of wars didn't go down the way movies tell it. Many fights ended before swords ever came out, decided by who starved first, whose horses dropped dead, or which side ran out of patience standing in the rain. Archaeological digs back this up. If you go poking through ancient battlefields, you're more likely to find broken farming tools, dented knives, and plain pottery shards than priceless swords. It's almost a running joke in archaeology circles. Everyday stuff was a lot deadlier than anything Hollywood loves to show off. You spend months expecting to find a lost Excalibur, and you dig up a grubby kitchen cleaver instead. Here's another twist. When historians pore over old court records, chronicles, and city archives, a pattern pops up. The winners of medieval wars weren't always the bravest guys charging into the fray. More often, the victors were people who knew how to cut off food supplies, poison wells, or slip secret notes across enemy lines. These shadowy figures didn't get the gloss of legend, but their handiwork tipped battles without anyone ever calling for swords. Knights, yes, they got their portraits painted and their names remembered, but they were the poster boys. The behind-the-scenes crew did a lot of the heavy lifting. It's the medieval version of giving all the credit to the quarterback, while the linemen are actually winning the game in the mud. The downside to thinking of the Middle Ages as a giant court of chivalry is simple. It blinds you to the dirtier, but way more interesting, ways people actually won. All that focus on honor hides the fact that clever tricks, silent poison, and a knack for sabotage were the best weapons anyone could hope for. If you wanted to survive or rule, you learned to play dirty and never trust your dinner was safe. At the end of the day, Hollywood got it wrong. Warfare back then had more to do with outsmarting your enemy than any big sword fight in the rain. Outpoisoning, outlasting, outmaneuvering. That was how you grabbed power and lived to tell the tale. And the people who perfected those skills, they were the original, uncredited special forces of the medieval age, lurking in kitchens, blending in at market stalls, or slipping through castle doors unnoticed. Spoiler, that's not the kind of thing you'll ever see on a knight's family crest. Now, if you want to meet the real heavy hitters, the kitchen maids, the poisoners, the traveling merchants, who made medieval warfare a lot more like a spy novel than a fairy tale, stick around. Because what comes next is the story of how these unsung experts turned dirty tricks into serious art. If you picture a medieval assassin slinking around dark corridors with a dagger between their teeth, you're missing their real weapon. Look in the kitchen pantry instead. Forget about swords and armor for a minute, because in the Middle Ages, the scariest thing at dinner wasn't running out of roast lamb. It was the chance your next meal would be your last. Poison was the true secret weapon, and it didn't take a trained killer to use it. All you needed was something tasteless, odorless, and easy to slip into soup. That's why kitchen maids and cooks got almost as much attention as bodyguards. Any ruler or high-up noble ate in a cloud of suspicion, paying people just to chew their food first. Who needs enemies with friends serving stew? Take arsenic, the medieval version of the invisible enemy. It was everywhere, sold as rat poison and supposedly for pest control, but everyone knew what could really happen with a vial of white powder and a grudge. Unlike flashy swords, arsenic didn't announce itself. It was tasteless and dissolved in water with no sign, meaning a nice glass of wine could kill just as quietly as any sword. You'd hear about royals and nobles who fell sick with mysterious fevers. Historians now say a lot of those cases were less about bad luck and more about bad stew, or someone with access to a kitchen shelf. Authorities tried to crack down on arsenic, requiring careful measurements, and even keeping lists of people who bought it. Yet it still flows through medieval murder stories like a bad river. But arsenic wasn't the only danger passing through the pantry. Medieval folks had a whole rogues gallery of poisons to pick from. Deadly nightshade berries, packed with something called atropine, were a favorite for people who wanted to cause a little chaos. Hallucinations, confusion, and sometimes death, all wrapped up in a pretty purple berry. Strychnine from Nux vomica seeds was right there, too, posing as rat poison, but serving a second job as a weapon for anyone desperate or ambitious enough. And let's not forget hellebore, a plant that could turn an arrow or a pie into a disaster. Drop that into the mix, and a medieval cook had the makings of a supervillain spice rack. It wasn't just about slipping things into food, either. The real challenge in medieval warfare was defending against invisible threats. Bread that went from bland to deadly, wine that could knock you flat, and makeup that didn't just make you look paler, but slowly made you paler by killing you. Hunting for signs of poison was a full-time job for the rich and powerful. Some lords even carried their own silver spoons, hoping that the metal would change color if it touched anything nasty, though that was more hope than science. Let's talk about sabotage, because not all dirty tricks happened at the dinner table. Medieval sabotage meant making things fall apart before a battle even got started. Undermining castle walls was a favorite trick. You dig a tunnel beneath the enemy's defenses, set some explosives or burn out the supports, and watch huge stones collapse while everyone inside panics. During the 100 Years' War, the English made a pastime out of tunneling under French city walls. When you hear about whole sections of castles crumbling, it's usually not rain or bad engineering. It's someone with a grudge and a shovel. But sabotage didn't just attack stone walls. Burning supply wagons or fouling up the water supply turned siege warfare into a waiting game where one side just had to starve or get sick first. This shadowy work was rarely done by swaggering soldiers. The real operatives often came disguised as someone you'd never suspect. Traveling merchants, for example, looked like they just wanted to sell you a bolt of cloth or a pouch of spices. In reality, they doubled as long-distance messengers and intelligence gatherers, passing secret codes and warnings while everyone else haggled over apples. Clergy, priests and monks included, were even better. Carrying news as part of their blessings, they slipped messages hidden in books or tucked into belts. Want to know what the enemy army's next move is? Ask someone in robes who spends all day pretending to listen to confessions. And then you had the Hashishin, a group so legendary their name still makes modern assassins jealous. Based in the Middle East, these men understood that terror, stealth, and a talent for psychological tricks could break an empire without a single bloody duel. They weren't hired to storm castle gates, but to send a message, sometimes by just showing up unseen, leaving enemies too afraid to sleep or eat in peace. The whisper that an assassin was near could spark panic all by itself. So, while movies glow with images of sword fights, the real special forces didn't bother with the front gate. They found the backstairs, the kitchens, or the trade routes. They worked with a smile, a blessing, or a kitchen ladle, and by the time anyone realized, it was already too late. But poison wasn't the sharpest blade in the medieval arsenal. Next up, let's talk about how a single rumor or a staged omen could break entire armies before the fighting even started. If you think a sword could turn the tide of battle, try picturing a rumor so convincing it empties a fortress before the first arrow flies. In medieval times, a few whispers in the right ears could send entire armies running for the hills. Let's talk about the real mind games medieval leaders played, because sometimes brute force was the backup plan. You might picture big, burly knights thundering across open fields, but the most powerful weapon in the room was usually a lie, a forged letter, or a staged sign from the heavens. Medieval warfare wasn't just about swinging steel, it was about getting inside the enemy's head and making them doubt their own strength before anyone even started swinging. Picture a medieval camp late at night, the fire burning low, and suddenly someone starts talking about a strange sickness spreading among the soldiers. A single story passed along in lowered voices, and panic starts to take root. That's all it took to throw an army into chaos. Medieval leaders knew how afraid people were of anything they couldn't explain, and they used it. A rumor about a cursed relic, a whispered warning about a traitor inside the ranks, or a forged letter hinting at plague. Each of these was enough to make soldiers think twice about sticking around for breakfast, let alone a bloody battle. Superstition ruled the medieval mind just as much as any king. People believed in omens, signs from the sky, and curses that could haunt a family for generations. Smart rulers learned to twist this to their own advantage. They arranged for divine messages to pop up at just the right moment, or had a friendly priest announce that the stars predicted doom for the enemy army. When you grew up hearing that the flight of a swallow or the color of last night's moon could decide your fate, you didn't need much more convincing. A well-timed omen could stop men dead in their tracks. Sometimes the only thing standing between victory and defeat was which side could stage a more convincing miracle. Recent studies show that spreading fake news is not a modern invention. It was a medieval power move. If you think misinformation is something that came with the internet, think again. Medieval spies and saboteurs made a career out of twisting stories to break enemy morale. Forged letters would fall into enemy hands with tales of betrayal or plots against the king. Merchants or wandering minstrels would spread stories of famine and disease as if they'd seen it themselves. Even a simple rumor about poisoned wells could empty a village in a day. If it sounds like a medieval version of a tabloid, that's not far off. The juicier the story, the better the results. The Mongols get a special mention for bringing psychological warfare to a whole new level. Instead of just rumors, they tossed actual diseased bodies over city walls. Now, aside from being seriously gross, this wasn't only about spreading plague. It was a message. We can kill you, even if you won't let us inside. The sight alone, bodies landing in the middle of a city, would send defenders scrambling, convinced they were doomed by invisible forces. The rumor mill would fire up instantly. Someone would say they saw a ghost. Another would blame a curse, and suddenly, the strongest walls felt paper thin. If you're looking for a famous example of fear-beating muscle, check out the Siege of Antioch. This wasn't just a classic standoff. It turned into one of the best cases of psychological warfare recorded in history. One side was starving and desperate until a rumor took off. Someone found a holy relic, supposedly a spear that had pierced Christ's side. Suddenly, the news spread like wildfire. Soldiers who'd been thinking about desertion were now sure they were on a mission from God. Their morale shot up overnight. On the other side, all it took was a few days of whispered stories to turn confidence into fear. The defenders, convinced that supernatural forces had turned against them, lost their nerve. In the end, belief did what thousands of warriors couldn't, tilted the outcome. The real winner in these mind games wasn't the one with the biggest army, but the side that made the other blink first. Whoever broke the enemy's nerve was halfway to victory before the first sword even left its sheath. In a world where belief and fear carried real weight, a few lies well told could do more damage than a season of battles. And if you think all this stopped with castles and armor, think again. The art of rumor staged truths, and weaponized fear never went out of style. They just moved to new battlegrounds and updated their tools. Next up, let's pull back the curtain on the people who actually pulled off these stunts, the forgotten shadow agents who reshaped history from the sidelines, often without anyone realizing until it was too late. You probably know the names of medieval kings, the occasional knight with a cool nickname, and a handful of nobles who lost their heads in a family feud. But when it comes to the people who really tipped the scales, most history books barely give them a footnote. The truth is, a huge chunk of medieval power struggles rested on the backs of men and women whose names you've never heard, and probably never will, because their one big rule was, don't get caught. Think about it. Behind every poisoned cup, every accidental fire, and every rumor that sent an army home in terror, there was someone quietly doing a job no one would thank them for. These were the medieval shadow agents, and the crazy part is, sometimes the fate of whole kingdoms came down to a servant with a cake or a merchant with a folded piece of parchment. Some of the biggest victories in medieval history happened thanks to precisely these unsung agents. Chronicles, like those by Walter of Gisborough and Geoffrey Le Baker, straight up admitted that military decisions often depended on information pieced together by spies. The Scots even had their own words for it. Espionage was slycht and satelt. And this wasn't just an English or French thing. John Barber, a Scottish writer, painted espionage as so normal he didn't even bother to make it sound sneaky. If you lived close to the edge, your best shot at making it out alive wasn't charging in with armor, but slipping out with someone else's news or supplies. Let's put that in perspective. The job description for a medieval spy or informant sounded simple. Collect information, deliver secret messages, twist the facts if you need to, and absolutely don't get caught. Fail, and you could look forward to some quality time with a rack or a red-hot poker, because nobody, and I mean nobody, liked spies on their turf. That didn't stop women, like Jocelyn Hellabout, who worked as a paid spy during the Flemish revolts, running undercover missions against Austrian troops. She pulled off 11 separate trips, gathering info and passing on intelligence for a fee, which in medieval terms meant risking your neck for about 11 shillings per job. If you think women just sat behind the scenes sewing banners, think again. The archives from Ghent show that women delivered hundreds of letters between rebel cities, making up a quarter of all secret correspondence during the war. It wasn't just women, and it wasn't just rebels. Monks, priests, and merchants all got in on the act. The church, with its army of robed travelers, was basically running the original gossip network. Priests heard confessions and nuns ran hospitals, all while quietly picking up valuable news or sneaking notes in the margins of prayer books. Merchants, who could travel without anyone thinking twice, used their trade networks as cover, selling apples by day, delivering false maps and secret codes by night. Medieval marketplaces, crowded with every kind of traveler, were the perfect places to pass off a message where nobody would notice. Here's the real challenge. How do you gather secrets in a world where everyone expects a trick and torture is the main way people handle suspicion? Governments got so paranoid about leaks that their records used special code words. For example, English officials wrote about paying people, in the king's secret business, a phrase that could mean anything from delivering a letter to pulling off full-blown spy missions. Sometimes these payments got lumped in with messenger costs, which was like hiding a spy's salary in the phone bill. There are records of guys like Frank de Hale, captain of Calais, getting big payouts for his messengers and spies, all in one receipt. Archaeological finds and dusty court records sometimes hand us glimpses of these agents and their methods. Coded notes hidden in walking sticks, wax seals broken and rewarmed, even scarves with secret knots. Most of the time, though, these people worked in total darkness. If they did their job well, no one ever knew whose side they were really on. When it comes to famous cloak and dagger moments, a couple top the charts. The betrayal of Constantinople in 1204 stands out, where someone inside the city quietly opened the gates, letting in the Crusaders and ending the empire. No knight in shining armor made that happen. It was an inside job, pure and simple, where subtlety counted for more than a dozen battering rams. Or take the Black Dinner of Scotland, which sounds like something from a murder mystery. A fake invitation led 2 unsuspecting teen lords to supper, where they were executed on the spot, leaving the family power up for grabs. There were so many others. Kitchen maids with poison pastries, monks sneaking letters under their habits, even knights sent disguised into enemy camps. The lines between messenger, spy, and liar blurred fast. Chroniclers like Jean Herard even complained about the problem, saying too many guys posing as heralds were just spies in fancy clothes. Occasionally, an agent's work would leave a record. More often, the only proof is a mysterious death, a sudden castle takeover, or a kingdom that changed hands overnight. So, next time you picture a heroic last stand or a dramatic clash of armies, remember who did the real heavy lifting. The fate of whole countries often rested on someone you wouldn't even notice at the banquet table. In the end, the deadliest weapon was a whisper delivered at just the right moment, and history's biggest moves happened in the shadows, not the spotlight. If you look past the shining armor and the sword fights, you'll see the real power players were the ones hiding in plain sight. The cook who slipped some powder into the soup, the priest delivering messages, the merchant with a hidden agenda. History remembers the battles, but victories belong to people who broke the rules. It wasn't about chivalry. It was about outsmarting, outlasting, and out-sabotaging the competition. Like Napoleon said, a single pope could match an army of 200,000 men. That's not movie magic, it's the influence of the shadows, still echoing in the secrets people keep today.